joining us from
Just amazing. It's amazing he gets away with that. I mean, every day.
He gets away with a lot, Joe. Okay,
yeah,
joining us now from Nashville, Tennessee, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Jon Meacham. His best-selling book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George H.W. Bush, is now out in paperback. Jon wrote about the former president in a piece for the New York Times over the weekend, and he concluded in the column with this. Donald Trump's ambition for attention, for power, is his defining characteristic. George H.W. Bush tempered his own ambition with empathy and dignity. Late in his years as Mr. Reagan's vice president, Mr. Bush was shown into a children's leukemia ward in Krakow, Poland. 35 years before, he and his wife Barbara had lost a child to the disease. In Krakow, one patient, a 7- or 8-year-old boy, wanted to greet the American vice president. Learning that the child was sick with cancer that had killed his own daughter, Mr. Bush began to cry. My eyes flooded with tears, he dictated to his audio diary, and behind me was a bank of television cameras. He told himself, I can't turn around, can't dissolve because of personal tragedy in the face of a host of reporters and our hosts and the nurses who give themselves every day. So I stood there looking at this little guy, tears running down my cheek, hoping he didn't see, but if he did, hoping he'd feel that I loved him. Mr. Bush is a voice from a past at once distant and close at hand, and a voice we should seek to heed, for we need that grace now in our own time. Wow, that's beautiful. And what a beautiful story, Jon Meacham.
It's one of the most extraordinary entries I found in the vice presidential diary, because we all know a lot of politicians, we all like a lot of politicians. I can imagine very few people in public life who would not have taken that moment and turned around and connected in the vernacular of politics with the public. In 1986, 1987, George Bush was seen as this buttoned-up patrician who was unable to connect. That became an exacerbated political condition in '92. When Bill Clinton would say, "I feel your pain," what that shows us is that George Bush felt our pain. He just didn't feel it was his role as president to show it.
Joe.
Well, and of course, Jon, the story we've all heard about George H.W. Bush that really summarizes this the most compactly is when he comes home from a baseball game and he starts to tell his mother how he did. And first of all, talk about that story and then talk about how that defined who George W. Bush was. Deeply, as you read your book, a surprisingly ambitious man, driven by ambition more than we would have ever imagined before reading your book. But like you said, always tempered with a sense of service.
It's one of the great complexities of his character, unquestionably. I once asked him, you know, if it were all about service, sir, you would have opened a soup kitchen. But instead, you sought ultimate authority in a nuclear age. What was that about? And several hours later, actually, he answered the question, and he gestures with that big left hand. And he says, it's be number one. It's be captain of the team. Whatever you're in, be number one. I've always been motivated by goal. Maybe there's something wrong with that, but in another sense, there isn't. And so he was always driven. The story you allude to is his mother would always say, no one wants to hear about the great I am. He'd say, you know, I got 2 hits, and she'd say, well, how did the team do, George? And I think one of the reasons that English sometimes seemed a second language when he was in the middle of speeches is he was hearing 2 voices in his head. One was the voice of the political class, which was talk about yourself, press ahead. And the other was Dorothy Walker Bush saying, don't be a braggadocio. And I think that those 2 imperatives conflicted led sometimes to a lack of articulation.
You know, Jon, not only that story, but the man's life itself, George H.W. Bush's life, it's hard to compare his life and the era in which he grew up and the era in which he served with what's going on today on the national stage of politics. But I've always thought, I'm wondering if you agree with me, that George H.W. Bush had a sense of mission and a sense of loss, in the sense he knew what it was like to lose something. He had been surrounded in World War II with men, his partners in combat, who lost their lives. He lost a daughter, and that helped form him. That helped shape his view of the humanity that he sought to serve on his larger mission as ambassador, as head of the CIA, as vice president and president.
That's exactly right. We don't think of him as someone with a sense of tragedy, but he has exactly that. You know, on the day he turned 18, June 12th, 1942, three things happened. It was his birthday, he graduated from Andover, and he drove to Boston and took an oath as a naval enlistee. He became what we believe to be the youngest flying officer in the Navy. On September 2nd, 1944, he was shot down, lost two of his crewmates. Imagine being 20 years old and having the other lives in your hands. It's something that's foreign from our experience now in many ways. And I asked him, both in terms of the combat experience and losing Robin in 1953 to leukemia, it's sort of one of these biographical questions you have to ask. What did you learn? What did you take away from that? And he said, on the first, in terms of combat, he said he always wondered, why was I spared?
Yeah.
And that drove him to try to justify, I think, the loss of others. And the second, with Robin, it was what it taught him was that life was, as he put it, unpredictable and fragile.
You know, John, as all this talk has come out of the Trump campaign about a rigged election and questions about whether or not the outcome of the election in a month or so, or less than a month, 3 weeks from today, will be respected by Trump and by his supporters, I think it's worth pointing to the letter that George H.W. Bush left for Bill Clinton when he was denied a second term by Bill Clinton. Obviously, I don't think he had the utmost respect at the time during the campaign for Bill Clinton. Thought obviously he should have been reelected. But the letter he left that ended with, "I'm rooting hard for you to succeed," showed that peaceful transition of power.
Absolutely. You know, Bush always believed in the system all the way through his life. He believed that America was run by people of essentially goodwill, trying to do the best they could to leave the world a little bit better off. He was a conservative in the classical sense, less a Reagan sense, interestingly. You know, as you know, as Joe knows, Reagan conservatism was about movement. It was about action. Bush conservatism really was about accepting the world basically as you found it and trying to make modest reforms and also trying not to screw things up. He used to say, how can we not make this worse? Which is not a bad standard. The other thing about the legitimacy of the election question is, as you say, you know, he got 37% in 1992. And it was a deeply embittering, for most people, would be an embittering election. He was down about it, unquestionably, but he accepted the verdict. He moved forward, and I think has been a model former president.
Jon Meacham, thank you very much. Jon's best-selling book, Destiny and Power: The American Odyssey of George H.W. Bush, is now out in paperback. And coming up, the maverick himself, Senator John McCain, has to walk back comments about blocking Supreme Court justices. We'll explain that, and we'll be joined by political analyst Elise Jordan and the Washington Post's Chris Eliza, who says it's getting very hard to see how Donald Trump wins. Morning Joe will be right back.